everything can come after the basics, but we can't have anything before that. And we need to have a solid foundation of an economy that we can support everything else around it.
I think even in family life, things can be so busy. We all have work and school and university and other commitments. And it's important just to take time, at least every day, or as much as possible, to sit down together and talk about what's on your mind, how your day's been, or any stresses at those commitments that are outside of the family home.
Sustainability is such a key word, like a buzzword nowadays, but at the end of the day, it does have quite a technical meaning, which involves social, economic and environmental protection embedded into one term.
I think the most important thing you need to have a good life is a healthy planet. Like, the Earth is the only known place in the universe that can sustain life. And for me, the climate crisis is a symptom of a much deeper problem. It's intricately tied to human rights violations, social justice, and it's also intricately tied to health and well-being. There's literal lives on the line because of the climate crisis, and now we're saying that 40% of young people are presenting to psychologists with eco-anxiety because they're really anxious about their future and it's affecting their health and well-being. So I think a healthy and sustainable planet, a renewed world, is really important for us to have a good life.
I suppose it all comes back to, as well, this idea of investing in a well-being economy. You know, there's been many job losses over the past number of years and people have really started to struggle. So I think as part of well-being, it's important to look at it in a health perspective, but also in an economic perspective, and measuring the economy now in a sort of well-being focus.
We have a cleaner environment than I think most countries. We have a lot of green space. We can get out, we can just reset, so to speak.
So I think that Northern Ireland does have a lot of strengths in relation to well-being, and a challenge with this maybe is that most of our services and our systems are somewhat reactive, and I think to be a real leader when it comes to well-being, we need to start preventative measures, so using our vision and imagination, and I think this is what Northern Ireland does best when we come together in successful partnerships and meaningful alliances.
Like, an ambitious climate bill is necessary, and soon. It needs to mitigate the effects of climate change, or there's no point in worrying about well-being, because people aren't going to have a good life if climate change is raging, which it will be if we don't have this robust climate bill. That's a really, really important one, and we need it as soon as possible.
So I think it's really important that we start building in community well-being and emotional well-being. Actually, I would support that right from an education level. I think we should have children in primary schools learning about their emotional health, even if that's just sort of the happy face and the sad face and what that means and how they feel. That can be a really good start to them expressing themselves. And the earlier that we do that, the more they will be encouraged to do that throughout their life.
We've touched on mental health, so I think it is important to kind of stick with that theme, because this was something that was a problem, you know, before COVID-19. So I think we have a real opportunity now over the next 10 years to properly tackle that.
We also need to consider justice and equity in these conversations about well-being, and centering empathy and compassion in our politics. And any action that we do take to improve well-being really needs to generate society-wide value.
Climate resilience isn't a kind of term that will be muddied, and rather it'll be used constructively with economic policies. So, for example, if there is flood defense technologies that are introduced, hopefully that can create jobs, long-term jobs, highly skilled jobs.
We need high-skilled jobs, because right now we have a brain drain in Northern Ireland. Anyone that's really clever doesn't stay in Northern Ireland, they go to England.
My message is that there are ways to improve well-being and the environment. It's not one or the other. Quite often they go hand in hand, like increasing public transport and green spaces. These two things, well-being and the environment, should be at the heart of policy and legislation going forward. Please don't let partisan issues or profit come before our people and our planet.
And finally, I would just encourage decision makers in Northern Ireland to be really bold, and to listen to civil society and what people are asking for.
Welcome back. Wow. I'd say there's some future politicians there. If we have any luck, they were amazing, so articulate, and some really good points. And we'll put some of those points to our political panel. I'm delighted to say, despite all that is going on, from the Green Party, we have Mal O'Hara. From the SDLP, we have Donal Lyons. Kelly Armstrong from the Alliance Party, Francie Malloy from Sinn Féin, and Mike Nesbitt from the Ulster Unionist Party. Thank you all for joining us. I appreciate that it's a tricky day politically, but this is really about the long-term things that we're looking at, and not what we're looking at over the next couple of weeks. So let's kick off, I think, with each of you. I'll start with you, Mal, and I'm going to ask each of you the same question to begin with, which is, what are your political visions for Northern Ireland? What's your big vision? What's your big plan?
Thanks very much, Tara. And I think, are you getting feedback from me there?
No.
No, okay. I think some of what we've just heard from civic society and from those young people feels like somebody's had a sneak peek at our manifesto ahead of the May election. If it's still going to be May, who knows, after today's events. So I suppose the premise of us as a Green Party is that we want a socially and environmentally just society. We want to end our reliance on fossil fuel and extraction and consumers' debt. We want to see a much more equitable society built on the values of peace and security, prosperity, safety, and equality. And I think that's really, you know, as a green movement, we've been talking about the environmental issues, obviously, for 4 decades now. And it's fantastic to see more and more that that's entering the political mainstream. You know, particularly for young people, I think that's one of their primary motivating factors. We want to see a reducing the gap between the wealthy and the poorest in society. We want to see an extension of opportunity for people. We need to resolve the unresolved issues of our legacy and our conflict. And we feel that the best way to do that is not through political parties' invested interest, maybe negotiating in back rooms about how we move past those problems, but actually empowering citizens to address them, like we did similarly in the early days around the Good Friday Agreement, and using constitutional or citizens' conventions to empower people to move forward on some of the intractable issues that we continually seem to get stuck on. So a socially just, environmentally sound and sustainable society and economy that reduces inequality, eradicates poverty, and promotes prosperity is the core message.
I mean, those are really big ideals, and we've already had a lengthy discussion this afternoon, and just about how difficult it is to cut through, how difficult it is to get politicians to agree on some of the most basic things, never mind those really big picture ideas you're talking about. I mean, you've had cut through. I mean, you can see that those young people, climate was number one. But do you get that cut through with older people? Do you think there's still a job of work to be done to see the Green Party emerge as a larger force within both local councils and within the Assembly?
Yeah, well, Tara, in recent elections, we've had increasing electoral success. You know, we've doubled our numbers of councillors at the last local government election. And I think people are widely becoming more and more environmentally conscious and aware. And I think that is permeating across all generations. I think for younger people, that's been in the curriculum for a period of time, so they value that. But, you know, it's that, how do we encourage people to stop smoking? We educated young people and that changed behaviours in the home. The same is happening around the environment, and we're seeing older generations, whether parents or grandparents, also beginning to think about, well, maybe it's time to front and centre environmental issues. And that's not negating the constitutional or identity politics, which is important, but it's about saying that's not the only prism that we need to see things through. We must look at the global and bigger picture. We must play our fair part. And, you know, that's why we're saying to people, it's time that we focus and prioritize environmental and social justice, and that will pay benefits for everybody in society.
Donal, I'll put the same question to you about the political vision for Northern Ireland. From the SDLP point of view, what's your big sell?
Well, we'd share a lot with what Mal has just said, and the SDLP's sort of social democrats do look to have an understanding of the world as trying to achieve some sort of balance. We can see, you know, the private sector, the market is the best model of generating wealth, but it's how that wealth is then distributed and used by agencies like the state or the public sector. And it is about achieving a socially equitable or socially just society where people have an opportunity to fulfill what their aspirations, their ambitions. And that's both in the professional world and educational world, but also cultural and indeed, as Mal said, the environmental aspect of it as well. And I think that is it is long overdue that that's come to the fore, and it's very important that that's come to the fore. One of the young people contributing at the start of this session talked about how one of the strengths in wellbeing in Northern Ireland is our access to green space. And that is true to a certain case, but quite often that access comes with barriers, and quite often that access isn't equal to everyone, particularly in urban environments like Belfast. So there is always work that's required by political parties, by the state, to readjust things so that they're more balanced in a more equitable sense. I also think, and it's one of these things, I'm not going to talk about the younger generations, but I think people and younger people are more aware of the global context now. And I think that's very clear in the conversations about climate and environmental degradation and the changing climate. But they're also aware of broader politics in senses of identities and ideas. And I think, without bringing Brexit to the fore so early in the conversation, I think a lot more people are now looking to an aspiration where maybe they would like to travel for a year or two, maybe they would like to experience different parts of the world, but then ultimately their aspiration is to come home to Northern Ireland. And I think we do have a job of work to do to ensure that there is a prosperous and a well-balanced and a well-serviced economy and society here for them to come home to and for them to contribute to. It is something that I think during the COVID period, we've seen a lot of people returning. Whereas the traditional models of going and living in a big urban centre, be it Dublin, London, or further afield, they've realised now that the value and the importance of services, the value and the importance of community and knowing your neighbours. That's something that people had forgotten for so many years, was just incidental who you lived beside. But now there's a sort of a re-evaluation and a re-appreciation of that sense of community.
The speakers there said, be bold, listen to civic society. Do you get we talk a lot about the disconnect between politicians and the community. Do you think as politicians you could do more to engage with people? And I don't mean knocking on doors. I mean a bigger picture, a better kind of narrative of, for instance, we talked earlier about how we're going to change the health service. There seems to be such reluctance amongst our politicians to actually make tough decisions.
I think civic society tends to be a couple of years ahead of political parties and political institutions at any given stage. And a couple of years is a generation in terms of politics. We've seen how the conversation has changed over the years. It was civic society who were advocating the need for early years intervention long before it became a topic of political conversation. It was civic society who had been advocating for a greater resourcing, and resourcing is a key word here, of services for communities that are sometimes overlooked or reduced down to our traditional green-orange divide. We have a multitude of communities in the city, and they span and they change as individuals have different areas. So we need to recognise the commonalities within those communities, but also the diversity within those communities. I think there is also...
sorry to cut across you, Donald, but I did just want to make the point there. You say that, but we don't have a childcare strategy. You say that, but yet we don't have equitable childcare coverage that the rest of the UK has, and that is down to the Assembly.
And that is down to the Assembly, and I would join with my colleagues in pointing out that the decisions of the Assembly are not the uniform decisions of everyone in that. I mean, a childcare strategy, the outrageous price of childcare, and actually I think David Sterling made that comment in the last session towards the very end there, the fact that we're starting to recognise the value of childcare as opposed to just the price of childcare. I think that's a hugely important learning from the last year or so. I suppose ultimately, I am a member of a political party, I'm an activist of a political party, and my urged solution would be to change how people vote, because political priorities depend on who is in the Assembly in larger numbers. And while we have a unique consociational style of government, a style of government, by the way, it was sold to us that civic society would be the opposition to. And I think that civic society has played a very strong role over the years in being that civic opposition to a consociational management style of government. But I do think that I'm not going to say all political parties act the same. We're quite clearly very different in our ideologies and approaches. But I do think political parties, the one commonality we have is that we need to listen to civic society more.
Thanks very much. Kelly Armstrong, if I come to you, give us your pitch. What's your vision?
As the Alliance Party, of course, we're committed to a shared society for all of us being together and dealing with all of the issues that we have. It was interesting listening to Donal there. One of the main ways that we can actually bring in civic society to deal with the environmental issues that we're all concerned about is through participatory budgeting, so PBs, to allow the community to come in and say, well, here's the amount of money, how do we want that spent, what is the priorities for us to spend on. Now we have we only have a draft programme for government, we never got to the actual programme for government. We know the outcomes that will help Northern Ireland. We know that there are people out there who can deliver upon those outcomes, and if we bring the community alongside so they have a fair and equitable say in what we're doing and how we're going to spend our money, then we can actually deliver upon co-production and co-design, these buzzwords that are used but never actually realised. It's not about people just being asked to tick a box on a consultation sheet. This is about actually bringing people along with us. Many of the community and voluntary sector that I worked in for donkey's years have been doing this for years. Their objectives are set up by the community. The objectives for delivery for government should be set up by the community. And there are areas, Armagh and Newry, are doing participatory budgeting where they're allowing the community to, and they take that away with an aim to deliver within the local area. So that's quite important. But there are big ticket issues. Alliance has been very aware of the importance of the environment coming forward and the importance of social justice. Now, one of the things, for instance, that we will be working on moving forward is the staggering difficulties that we have with welfare reform. The independent review of welfare mitigations is coming forward. We need to deal with that. I'm just away from a meeting with Gráinne Long from the Housing Executive, where there's 4,300 people who are sitting in homeless temporary accommodation at the moment. We know we need to retrofit all social housing. We know we have a problem with social care workforce. We need to invest in those people who are caring for our most vulnerable residents across Northern Ireland, yet they're paid the least amount of money. We need to provide a universal, affordable childcare. We need to hold citizens' assemblies to place social dialogue and equity at the centre of decision making. And we have to demand tax justice. Those who should be paying tax should be paying it, and that tax should be put to good use for people. There's lots there I could go into and start to spout on about our manifesto, but at this stage, just to say, Alliance has been listening to people. We brought forward our Alliance Green New Deal, that many people recognise Green New Deal is something that's been talked about for a long time, but it's time to enable citizens, our environment and social justice to move to the fore. And we believe that should be done not in the normal Northern Ireland Troubles rhetoric. It's time to move beyond that. Young people have moved beyond that. We are a society together that together can make a difference.
But do you accept, Kelly Armstrong, that there is a disconnect, that, you know, what those young people are talking about is not what makes up it might make up the agenda this week because of the climate change bill, but, you know, we've been slow to start. We're the last place in the UK to even have climate legislation. I mean, how can we stand over that?
And you only have to look at the debates that have happened this week over the climate change bill and how long those hours of discussions have taken place and the divisions that have happened, the many, many divisions that have happened, and the fact that we're having to go into more days to actually cover that bill. There are difficulties. There are difficulties with different vested interests coming forward and saying that they don't want to have heavier targets. Some others saying you're not going far enough. But the one way that we can do that is to sit down. It's to look at what we have to achieve for the benefit of everyone. If we're talking about people's well-being, then we have to create an environment and a society that makes people healthy, not makes them sick. And part of the way to do that is to provide people with a good way of living, healthy housing, access to protect them, to have a good health service. And the only way we can do that is to move forward with some of the actions that are in the climate change bill. It's not all about CO2 emissions. It is about bringing a better way for society. And to be honest, I'm up for that challenge. A lot of us here are up for that challenge. We'll take the abuses from whoever wants to throw it at us, and we're going to those many hours of debates. I've had it myself with the debate for the integrated education bill. You know, there are many hours of debates, but we're starting to see a change. We're starting grouping together in a slightly different way, coming together in agreement to move this place forward.
Okay, Francie Malloy, I'll come to you next for your pitch. You know, what's your vision at this point for Northern Ireland?
Well, I was just reading the conference title, what kind of an All Ireland do you want? And it reminded me of Terence O'Neill back some years ago, actually asking the question that Ulster was at a crossroads, and what kind of an Northern Ireland do you want? I actually don't want just a Northern Ireland. I want a united Ireland. I want to see the visions enhanced more to actually include, whether it's environment issues, education issues, or health issues, that we look at them on an all-Ireland basis, because we're too small of an area. And unfortunately, the way that partition has developed this country is that we have two of everything: education system, health systems, and everything else. So we do need to actually look at this small island to actually look at what we can achieve and how we can look forward to. And like the environmental issues, the climate issues, they don't stop at the border. And the issues, there needs to be unity across the thinking of how we actually move forward. Partition has failed all, failed nationalists, failed unions. Whenever it happened, there was a slap in the mouth to the nationalists, and the South seemed to walk away and leave us on our own. So it has failed, and the same, it has failed to unions, because unions to some extent are always looking over their shoulder regards what is the next initiatives that nationalists are going to come up with, actually, which will put them out of where they are, or drop them out of ascendancy, and they already have lost that position. So we do need to look at, we had the Good Friday Agreement, which was to signal a way forward. It has failed because it wasn't fully implemented by the British government. We talk about the voice of the people and bringing people in to have their say. A referendum on Irish unity would give people that opportunity to have a say, but the British government failed, and the Secretary of State failed to actually to even set out what the criteria would be in that situation. So we do need to hold the British government to account when they make agreements, that they stick to those agreements. And we know around, whether it's climate change, education, or the broad politics, that unfortunately the British government make commitments one day and break them the next day, and the same thing around Brexit. And if you look at actually how the whole situation develops, the Secretary of State, as he was doing today and done last night, of actually walking away and saying, well, I'm not going to intervene whenever the legislation has been changed around it. And for Brendan Lewis to actually to say that he is going to break the law is an example of what sort of an example is that setting to young people today, where we actually say we need to bring people together. So we do need to actually to set out what is it, whenever agreements are made, are we going to implement those agreements, and what is the issues that actually need to come around that. And the reneging of those agreements is not the way forward. We want to see a climate change across. We set the target as the Assembly done this week, of actually setting the targets to bring that about as quickly as possible. And we want to see it across the island of Ireland from Sinn Féin's point of view. And the same when we're talking about job creation, we need training to go along with those job creation, because we find in my own constituency here, Mid-Ulster, big engineering sector, but yet there's no training facility to bring new young people into that facility. And whenever the new generation come into this, they actually they left us an engineering structure which could be lost to this, and one of the big generations in this. So we do need to have the proper training of young people, and the link between childcare and education, and childcare properly funded and resourced, that it's not simply the grandparents and the aunts and uncles who actually are left to deal with childcare, that it must be integrated fully into education. If you think of how the childcare situation could develop, if we talk about not sending children to school until they're 5 or to 6, just what that would mean to working mothers trying to actually to facilitate to carry on working at the same time. So I think there's a lot that we need to look at across the island of Ireland.
So from your point of view then, I mean, people will appreciate your macro politics and your, your ultimate, aspirations. But when it comes to now, it's the same question I put to Donal. There is no childcare strategy. We're left in a position here where parents are helped less than in the rest of the UK. Why has that come about in your view?
Well, I think to a large extent it has come about because we're dependent on the British Exchequer to give us a block grant. And out of that block grant, people have actually, the ministers and others have actually tried to alleviate some of the worst elements of the strategy of the Conservative government of cuts and the making people pay more. And whenever the Assembly tried to deal with some of those issues and put legislation in place to actually to lessen the hardship of that, they were penalised by the British government. So if we don't have full control of our economy, if we're dependent on the block grant to actually deal with it, then we will never actually be able to do what we would want to do. And a large part of what actually has happened is that the cuts that have happened have actually meant that the childcare strategy has actually had to be curtailed and we want to see that develop. But there's a fine aspect of money and finances that actually have to be managed. And unfortunately,
and the choices, the choices that have to be made.
Every department.
Yeah, thanks for that. Mike Nesbitt, if we talk about your vision, first of all, is yours any different from the other panelists?
Well, Tara, I'm looking at the title of the conference, what kind of Northern Ireland do we want? And given the day that's in it, I have to say it is absolutely not the sort of Northern Ireland that the DUP seem to be about to deliver for us. I think it's incredibly destructive, what they say they are planning to do, and I condemn it utterly. It is a tactic. It is a short-term tactic which is all about self-interest. What we need is long-term strategic thinking, the sort of societal strategies that the young people were talking about in that video clip before we started this discussion. And the people who are going to be hurt first are the most vulnerable. The victims and survivors of the conflict will still not get a new commissioner appointed. The people who have been waiting 5 years for an apology because of the institutional abuse they were subjected to will not get their apology. And so it goes, and so it goes. But in terms of my vision, I'm a bit of a fanboy of Carnegie UK because of their emphasis on well-being. And if history does say anything about my time in politics, I hope they will identify my crusading on mental health and well-being as the key, because that's where I am. And I applaud Robin Swan, by the way, for mental health no longer being the Cinderella of the health service, appointing a mental health champion, a proper 10-year strategy. And I was with him in the constituency 2 days ago as he gave £100,000 to a mental health charity. Having said that, I think we've got to get away from medicalizing the problem. There's certainly a place for pills and tablets, but it's also about societal interventions. It's about relationships. It's about understanding each other and having proper empathy for what is going on. And the sort of Northern Ireland I want to build will be built around what I call a prosperity agenda. And that comes from examples of, for example, being a victims commissioner and seeing the number of people with poor mental health and well-being who don't get out of bed in the morning with a sense of purpose. So I want more people to get out of bed with a sense of purpose, built around a job that they consider to be fulfilling and worthwhile. So at the end of the day, they can go to bed with a sense of achievement, maybe a bit of frustration, but that frustration fuels us all to get up and go again in the morning. It's also about empowering people, and we're talking about where power lies. I think it's a very good question. 24 years after we got the powers back from Westminster up to Stormont, why have we not rolled those powers off the hill into the councils, through councils, into communities? Because all the research I've seen says the closer you can get informed decision making to the family or domestic unit, whatever way that's constructed, the more chance there is of making people's lives better. And yet it seems to me we've got two powers running our government up at Stormont who are command and control and want to hold on to that power. And I just want to reply to Francie, because I agree, childcare is a huge issue. But can I say, for 5 years, Francie, I chaired the scrutiny committee of the Executive Office, and before that, the Office of OFM DFM. And you sat on £12 million in a budget for childcare and did not spend it because you couldn't agree it. So that is part of the problem. There's no point pointing the finger at Dublin or London. The problem rests with ourselves as well. And we need to be honest and we need to be transparent with people about what we're doing,
just to clarify,
what we can do and what we cannot do.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, though, and I assume, Francie, you're going to come back on this, that, I mean, you're talking about the Sinn Féin members of the executive sitting on the £12 million rather than personalising it to Francie.
It would say it was the office of the First and Deputy First Minister, so it was the DUP and Sinn Féin in that office, as they have been since 2007.
Francie, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, to clarify, I think, and I meant to say it earlier, we don't actually have a government. We have an assembly. So the British government prorogued Stormont originally 50 years ago, and we have no government. We have an assembly, and they should be greater use to that assembly. But in relation to sitting on 12 million, the executive overall sat on it. First of all, I wasn't a minister. I was one of those within the scrutiny committees who actually questioned on a continuous basis the issues that actually were being raised at the time, and at certain times actually, was frowned upon because some of the issues I was raising within those, because I was challenging not just unions ministers, not just DUP, but our own ministers at different times whenever I thought it wasn't following line. So there has to be agreement, but to play this off as just the two problem parties is false, because it is one executive and all parties are sitting in that executive. So each one of them have a responsibility for delivery.
I'd be interested in getting Kelly Armstrong's view on that, Kelly, because obviously your party's on the executive as well, but you have one seat on the executive. Does that make it more challenging? Does it make it almost impossible to get decisions made in your favour?
Well, Naomi Long is not somebody that shies away from asking for things, but you only had to look at the fiscal... Sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback. You only have to look at the Fiscal Commission's decisions about how badly the Department of Justice has been treated, and it has the most cuts and the least budget. But it is quite difficult. We often find ourselves as the piggy in the middle, I have to say, that we're trying to balance off against others.
Okay. I'm just aware of the time, so I'm just going to do a quick fire at the end because we're almost out of time. Mal, I'm going to come to you. I just want to, really leave it on a positive note, because the Trust has made, great strides, put in some really positive suggestions within this report. And I suppose what most people would say is that the ultimate responsibility then, we have to look to our councils, we have to look to the Assembly to try to implement that. Is there something that we could change that would make things a little bit better, a little bit more effective and efficient?
Yeah, Tara, I think there's a whole host of things, and I'm really glad to hear Mike talk about devolving powers essentially to local councils. We're a party of grassroots democracy. We believe that the closer we are to people in terms of decision making, more practical, that leads to better decisions being made and empowering people. So I think we need to explore that, particularly for Belfast as the regional capital, as a driver for employment and opportunity. I think there are specific asks around Belfast and transferring some powers there. I also think that we need to have a serious and considered conversation about moving on from what we call the ugly scaffolding of the Good Friday Agreement. So we used it 24 years ago, and that was set up that maintained an absence of violence to a large extent. But have those structures worked? I don't feel they have. And rather than, we've seen St Andrews Agreement Haas 1, Haas 2, fresh start, the audacity, I think, of the five-party executive to call it a fresh start. 7 months, 8 months later, it collapsed. Then we had New Decade, New Approach, and we're in continual crisis and stasis, as evidenced by today. And I think the fundamental problem of that is that has been two governments and often 2 parties, but sometimes 5 parties, locked away in chambers, hammering out some sort of deal that may or may not appease their vested interests. We would be very firmly of the belief that we put that back to people, and we empower people, we empower civic society to get around some of those particular sticking points, Tara. And that is the way about we can rejuvenate trust and confidence in our political system. We've seen repeated polls that say people are fed up of the dysfunction of Stormont. You know, and I know there's lots of important legislation coming through at the minute, but I think after 24 years in government, has it really delivered what we thought it would? And the promise of the Good Friday Agreement, for me, that's an absolute no. And that's why we need to give it back to the people.
Okay, thanks very much. Donal, the same question to you. Is there something that we can take away that's positive? It's a suggestion for better government, better cooperation between all the parties?
I think what we need to do is increase transparency, and I think there's a couple of mechanisms like that. The citizens' assemblies in the south have been very valuable in terms of a more deliberative conversational approach to some of the big issues. Kelly mentioned participative budgeting. I think that is a very important tool. No one suggests that the financial reserves are unlimited. And it is about a matter of prioritisation. And I'll hand that to Mike Nesbitt quite happily. Mike, when he was leader of the Ulster Unionists, in some of those private meetings, I was there as a policy wonk in the background, but Mike prioritised mental health, and he deserves the credit for bringing that up in some of the crisis talks. He was consistent in public as well as private in what he did, but I have to say that's not the same for all parties who were in that room at the time. So I do think we need to bring civic society closer into the Assembly. I do think we need to explain some of the financial aspects. The Barnett consequential of childcare, as has been pointed out, was 12 million. We did receive that. It wasn't the Treasury. The problem wasn't London. The problem was our local failure to deal with a system and to agree a system that would help out parents and particularly young mothers to get back into the workforce and so forth. So having citizens' assemblies, having a participative thing may answer certain questions. Why is the Executive Office dealing with childcare? Why is the Executive Office dealing with the High Street Task Force? Why is it that all these funding streams are being centralised into TEO and not being left to other departments which are a more natural position to actually deal with them? Why aren't the councils being empowered to deal with the specific situations, be it Royal Avenue in Belfast, be it the Main Street in Derry or rural areas? The councils are perfectly positioned there to make those local decisions. But what we've seen, which has accumulated with the creation of a whole separate government department now, is a centralisation into everything, into OFM, DFM. The name was changed, it was slightly rejigged, but more and more power is going to a more opaque place in the centre of our government. And that's eating away.
Sorry to cut across you, just aware we've still 3 speakers just to give their ups. Francie, I just want to, say this with the caveat of understanding your longer term aspirations, but within the system we have at the minute, is there something we could do? Is it a citizens' assembly? How do we bring people closer to government?
Well, I think certainly the citizens' assembly and using the other chamber in Stormont would be a means of actually doing that, of bringing the citizens into that. We've found in the south that actually has worked well. We need another one, an All-Ireland one, dealing with the issue of planning for an All-Ireland. But one of the problems I think that has happened is that all departments, and it affects all right across every political party, have held on to the power within Stormont. I was one of the people who actually fought against the reduction to 7 councils, and thankfully we got support from unions and all within it. And eventually our own party fell into the same line that we actually needed to change it. But if we'd went down to 7 councils, imagine the fact that actually would have had on it. We do need to devolve more to the local councils, because local councils can actually deliver on the ground. And I find that, I was in the council for a number of years. I found you got things done quicker and more efficiently when you're in local government than we are in the assembly or anywhere else within it. So I do think we actually do have to look at the devolving of those administrations, but we do need to bring in the citizens into the discussion and to be part and parcel of the planning for the future.
Okay, thanks very much. Mike, Citizens' Assembly, will it get your vote?
Yes, I think there's a role for participative democracy. We can do one thing and they could do another, actually, because what we're not very good at is looking beyond the 5 years of a mandate. And there are certain issues like climate, like energy policy, that we need a 20, 30, 40, 50-year look at. So there's a way that you can divide up responsibility. But Tara, you asked for something positive. And I think something positive is this: irrespective and with no disrespect or prejudice to your constitutional preference, whether it's status quo or change, we all have a duty to make Northern Ireland work, measured by the well-being and prosperity of our people, by the quality of our public services, and by what we leave as a legacy for the next generation. In other words, the environment and climate change. And if we're going to look at, for example, Kelly talked about budgeting. We need to look at gender budgeting. We really do, because if we put a lot of money into construction, as we need to do, we will create jobs for men. If we put money into social care, as we need to do, we'll create a lot of jobs for women. We need to be aware of the balance between the two to be fair and equitable to all our citizens.
Thanks for that. Kelly, I'll give you the last word. Bring us out on a high.
I am going to try to, for the day that it is. We all know the grandstanding that's happening today, but believe me that there are politicians who are committed to delivery. There are those of us who are bringing forward legislation, who are debating on legislation that are important to everyone. People who are talking about my integrated education bill or the Climate Change Act. The budget is still to come forward, so please do take heart. There are some of us who left very good jobs in the community and voluntary sector to come and work in this assembly. And we are committed to you and to your voices and to making sure that this place works. Because if it doesn't, what option do we have? We'll export young people out of this place. And as a mummy, I don't want that to happen. I love this place. I love the people that I work with. Don't maybe agree with them all the time, but we're ordinary people the same as the rest of you. And it's in our interest that this place works, because our families, our friends live here too.
Kelly, thanks very much to all of you. Appreciate you giving up your time. You've just got 7 minutes to go and hear the statement. I should just say as well, the DUP were supposed to be on the panel today, but the person who was supposed to be joining us is ill. So, you know, that's just to be transparent and straightforward about that, because it would have been great to hear their views as well. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let's move on now. I know we can't stop a Zoom without waving. We'll move on to our next guest. I'm delighted to have our next speaker to deliver our second keynote speech of the afternoon. And really, what better time, given everything that we've talked about today, everything that politicians have raised, what our panel earlier had raised, and that's Dr. Dennis McMahon, who is Permanent Secretary of the Executive Office. And he's going to tell us how the Executive is planning to manage change and to bring wellbeing to the centre of the Executive Office. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you for inviting me to this session today. I'm delighted to be part of a conversation which is so central to everything that we do. When we talk about wellbeing, we often move straight to methodologies and bypass some of the deeper issues that drive our behaviours and those of others with whom we wish to create a new future. For a number of reasons, when I looked into this, it became clear that it was important to look back at some of our famous psychologists, in particular Carl Jung, who was a 20th century psychologist who talked about archetypes and who talked about a collective subconscious. Now, that might all seem a bit highfalutin, but really what this is about understanding that a lot of what we do as people is habitual, and that doesn't matter if you're a senior policymaker to a person on the ground. So why is that important? The reason is that a great many ideas hide in our subconscious, in our psyche, and they don't get surfaced. And I suppose one of the wonderful things about well-being is it's a way of surfacing some important ideas. So what I see here is a process of moving and making clear the invisible forces and opportunities which we need to grasp if we are to achieve genuine change. The language of well-being, together with words such as outcomes, curves to be turned, outputs and co-design, all seem like very technical issues. But they're part of a coherent toolkit that recognizes, one, how we perceive and how we experience the world and how that reflects our society. Two, How we experience the world is determined by factors that directly or indirectly affect everyone else. And 3, our experience and how we feel can determine how we influence others and lead change at all levels and for everyone. Once we consciously reflect on that, we begin to really understand what we need to do as policymakers, as partners in design, as partners in delivery, and as people just living here. Once we realize that much of this is about influencing what goes on in our own heads and in the heads of others, we can really begin to make a difference. So with your agreement, we're just going to unpack some of these tools. So I'm not sure if I'm showing now a slide which is the status of the programme for government. And I'm not sure if people were thinking of Carl Jung when they wrote this paragraph, although it's entirely possible. But we can see some really important words which I've highlighted. Words with a clarity and hard edge, such as outcomes, and words, many other words, which talk about relationships. Words such as inclusive, society, respected, cared for, fulfilling. No one is excluded. And now we get to the heart of the challenge. On the one hand, many of us grew up through our professional lives learning about doing stuff. That stuff might be concrete, such as money, resources, or staff, depersonalized people, or legislation, rules which must be obeyed, or IT, machines that think for us, or procedures, standardization. All of these things are really important. In fact, they're vital for delivery at scale, for transactions, but then how do we deliver relationships at scale? Well, you could do worse than starting with a clear aspiration for the change and follow up by measuring how we're doing against that change. So you can see here, our overarching objective is to improve well-being for all. And you can see that a successful programme for government that delivers the kind of society that the executive would like to see, an inclusive society where outcomes of well-being are the drivers for government. Another famous psychologist was Maslow, who talked about the hierarchy of need. And the hierarchy of need really shows that we start off with some very basic needs, our physiological needs, food, warmth, safety, and then you move up the hierarchy into belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. And if you think about a lot of what we're really trying to do in society, it's about helping people to get on the first step of that ladder in some cases, and then to help them to move up that hierarchy, to help them to really make the best of their lives. So the Maslow's hierarchy is really a way of thinking about what it is, what our task is, and what we're trying to achieve through our programs for government. Can we as individuals make all of this happen? Probably no is the answer. We can't do this for everybody else. But we can do something to meet the basic needs, and we can, more importantly, create the conditions for people to move up their own hierarchy. So bringing this into the practical realm, we need to understand what matters most to people, and therefore where people are on their own journey. We need to identify tailored methods to achieve change, and we need to keep talking with people who know what's going on. We need active engagement. So this is really where we come to the programme for government outcomes. Now, at the moment, we don't have an agreed programme for government. I'm very hopeful that we will have a programme for government the next year. But we have had a lot of work in developing outcomes. Over recent years, we've had a fundamental change in terms of how we think about this. And our programme for government is really a way of setting out where we want to go, the destination, in more detail. And you can see in this wheel that the final programme may change, but actually most of these outcomes will still be there. So we're talking about our children and young people having the best start in life. We're talking about living and working sustainably, protecting the environment. And some of the earlier discussions reflected a lot of that. We have an equal and inclusive society where everyone is valued and treated with respect. We all enjoy long, healthy, active lives. Everyone could reach their potential. Our economy is globally competitive, regionally balanced, and carbon neutral. Everyone feels safe. We all respect the law and each other. We have a caring society that supports people throughout their lives, and people want to live, work, and visit here. So one way of looking at the world, as I said earlier, is really a transactional way of looking at the world. And this is really an important way to see how a lot of business is done in government. Actually, it's done in a lot of different organizations. So it really involves starting with resources and assuming that if I put resources into a particular investment, I'll get a certain output. And there's a question mark against that. And then there's a question mark if I get a certain output. So say, for example, we put a certain amount of money into hospitals and we get a reduction in waiting lists. That's the output we're looking for. But is that the outcome? If we reduce waiting lists, does that actually help people to live longer, more fulfilled and healthier lives? Perhaps, but perhaps not. Perhaps the issues that we need to deal with are earlier on in the life cycle before people need to go into hospital. So it provides clarity and accountability of what we need to deliver, and it gives everyone a collective understanding of what needs to be done. But the thing about it is there's a massive difference between outputs and outcomes. We can guess that doing something or paying money to achieve something will achieve an outcome, but we can never be certain. There are too many factors and it's too complicated. But what it does help us to do is it helps us to ask some really good questions about the relationships between people and organizations, about what organizations are supposed to deliver, and about the outcomes that we want to see achieved. So to move into really a much more transformational approach, which is really about saying that we're dealing with people here and we're not dealing with a factory making certain products. We have to think differently. This means understanding and growing real human relationships between people and the object of their work and the environment. That leads us into this, which is a more continuous cycle. And this is about actually having a conversation, a good conversation based on real data and evidence. It's about evaluating what we do. It's about designing new options. It's about thinking those through, preferably co-designing them with the people who use the service and need the service, and then working our way around to see, is this actually delivering what we hoped it would? We see it as a continuous cycle, and we can apply accountability for outcomes and products, but we need a different kind of accountability for outcomes. Oh, and in my view, this kind of accountability requires a level of kindness, which is not a word you hear applied too often when you talk about accountability. And what I mean by that is it needs a sense of forgiving people for making mistakes if they are trying new ideas. Because if we don't try new ideas, we will get the same outcomes, and that's not a satisfactory position. So that moves us into a different kind of model called outcomes-based accountability. And in outcomes-based accountability, the programme for government is underpinned by a budget and supported by the key executive strategies. It has business planning and business case processes, the same kind of processes that we use normally. And it has effective, collaborative, accountable and transparent governance and monitoring arrangements. And what that means is we really start to count what matters, not just money, but actually what is happening on people's journey and how far we're influencing that. And I'm gonna give some examples of that in a moment. So this is probably a hard slide to see, and for colleagues who can't see it, don't worry if you can't see all of the detail. But what we've got here are a series of programs, and we start with the inputs and we identify what we've actually done and what sort of impact that has had. So if I give you one example, one of the programs here is the Transition Support Program, and this is for 3,000 parents and their children who are maybe going through particular challenges because their kids are going through transition and they're maybe struggling at school or they're struggling with educational outcomes. And in this program, we had 3,000 parents with 100% reporting that it helped them. Now that means we knew what we were delivering, and we knew that people felt there was a sense of satisfaction that the service they were getting was helping them. But that's not good enough. We need to know what is the outcome. And the outcome here was that there was a 79% improvement in self-efficacy. Now again, self-efficacy could be replaced with a much simpler word, which is confidence. And confidence doesn't sound like the most important thing in the world, but it's absolutely crucial. We have a huge body of research that shows that people who feel that they're buffeted by the winds of fate will tend to have lower health outcomes, educational outcomes, and later on in life employment outcomes, and they'll probably not live as long, and they'll suffer from more chronic conditions. So increasing confidence early in life actually is hugely important. And I am personally an example of that, having failed my 11 plus and having gone to a school where I felt a very low level of self-efficacy, and then having to build that up in life. So I know there is truth in this, these analyses. So that moves us on to another example. And really what I want to do is I want to say, this is all very difficult and there's lots of challenges in it, but it can be done. Now, what this shows is two graphs. And these graphs are, well, one of them is really just highlighting a section of the first graph. So if you look at the left-hand side, this has been taken from the Department of Education. And the blue line at the top is the number of children in grammar schools getting 5+ GCSEs, including maths and English. And at the bottom line, the pink line, is the number of children in non-grammar schools getting 5+ GCSEs, including maths and English. Now, for those of us who've maybe moved beyond this stage, we might not realise the significance of that. Without 5+ GCSEs, including maths and English, most of the jobs you want to apply for, many of the opportunities are closed down to you. That's not to say you can't get in through other routes, but it's a really, really important point. And what happens in school, if you get your confidence knocked, that can impact on the rest of your life because you can spiral into other issues. So in 2013 and 14, there was a new scheme implemented under the Delivering Social Change Initiative. And that scheme actually didn't get a lot of publicity at the time, but it should have done, because what happened was the executive decided to fund 232 new teachers who had just come out of university, but who didn't have any jobs. And they were brought in to teach maths and English, and it didn't quite work that way. Now, the reason why the graph on the right is included is because I wanted to highlight something for you. If you take a look at 2013-14 for non-grammar school, that's the bottom line. Every year for about 10 years, that had gone up by 1 percentage point. And in 1 year, and this is the whole population, so this is not just a small group or a pilot project, the whole population, if you look at the whole population of non-grammar schools, it went up by 6% in 1 year, unprecedented. And it then went up by a further 5%. And if you then go to the left-hand side, you will look at the gap between grammar schools and non-grammar schools and how that is closed. And that year was absolutely crucial. What's really interesting about it is, in 2013-14, that you got a large increase. In 2014-15, you got a large increase. And then that additional funding was removed. Now, this was funding that was there for a period of time. So it was additional resource, and it was found for a couple of years to do that. And it had a sustained effect beyond that. But what it is, it's almost like a social experiment, and 13,000 children got better results over that. That study is actually online, and it can be accessed by anybody. I just wanted to leave you with that because I wanted to give people a bit of hope. We can do this. There's absolutely no doubt we can do this. But what is required is a very, very clear understanding of the relationship between evidence, between what's going on in our heads, and I include policymakers, I include politicians, I include everybody else, and what's going on in the head of the people that we serve. So I'm going to finish on a final note just to say that this sort of learning needs now to be built into our future. And, you know, okay, there's lots of uncertainty, there's lots of instability, there's political issues happening at different points in time, but the situation is the same. And we will definitely be working on outcomes. I cannot see any way that we could go back to not thinking about this. And as a result of that, the head of the civil service, Jane Brady, is currently putting together a transformation program, which is going to focus on early interventions, skills, and a green economy. And we have an opportunity to try some of the lessons that we learned, and not everything worked, by the way, under Delivering Social Change, but we have an opportunity to take that learning now and to really create a new future. So we have done it, we can do it, and we certainly will do it in the future, is my view. And I want to thank everybody who's involved in this incredible work on well-being, because this will be the best hope we have for creating the economy and the society that we need and the people here deserve. Thank you very much.
Dennis, thank you very much. I mean, that last graph that you've left us with on the social change is just fascinating and just shows what can be achieved. And, you know, we talk so much about the difference between non-grammar and grammar education, and just to see those kind of lines getting closer, I think it just leaves everybody with a sense of optimism. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's brilliant to hear. We're going to take a slight pause, and it's really just to see if at your tables you would take just a few moments to give us your thoughts on what you think we can do to improve collective well-being in Northern Ireland. We're just going to take about 5 minutes to do that, but I think it's really important, and the Trust really wants to get some feedback on this, and we will feed that back to both policymakers, both politicians, and everybody else who's been involved. So we'll be back very soon in about 5 minutes. Thanks.